Hello, America. Welcome. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have two great guests tonight, Senator Tom Cotton and Victor Davis Hanson. But before I go to our great guests, we really need to take a step back and see what's happening to our country. I couldn't be happier that you're here this evening. There was a great philosopher, he didn't live that long, but a great philosopher in the 1800s. His name was Frederick Bastiat. He wrote a little book called The Law. Ronald Reagan had that book, among many other books, on his bookshelves at his home, because what the man said was incredibly profound. And I want to quote him very, very briefly to lay the foundation for what I want to get to with you this evening. He said, "The law perverted, and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose, but made to follow an entirely contrary purpose. The law become the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself is guilty of the evils it is supposed to punish." He said, unfortunately, law by no means confines itself to its proper functions. And when it has exceeded its proper functions, it is not done so merely in some inconsequential and debatable matters. The law has gone further than this. It has acted in direct opposition to its own purpose. The law has been used to destroy its own objective. It has been applied to annihilating the justice that it was supposed to maintain, to limiting and destroying rights, which its real purpose was to respect. The law has placed the collective force at the disposal of the unscrupulous, who wish without risk to exploit the person, liberty, and property of others. It has converted plunder into a right in order to protect plunder, and it has converted lawful defense into a crime in order to punish lawful defense. That was written almost 200 years ago, and that is exactly what's happening to our country today with the Democrat Party and this Marxist movement. Let's just take a big picture look here. Let's look at the federal level, the judges, the Department of Justice, as applies to former President and candidate Donald Trump. In Washington, they used a D.C. grand jury to bring Florida charges, venue shopping in violation of Department of Justice rules for prosecutors and grand juries, grand jury abuses by the so-called special counsel, including the denial of attorney-client privilege and due process to the former president. That is, using attorney-client privilege information, discussions with your lawyer and lawyer's notes with a grand jury, in which you don't have a lawyer there, in which you can't provide exculpatory information, in which you cannot challenge anything. We have a prosecutor working for Jack Smith who's accused of extorting a lawyer. Seems pretty serious to me. That is, he said he would help him get a judgeship in exchange for telling his client to turn state witness against former President Trump. Where is that now? It's being investigated in secret by the chief judge of that district, who's another Obama appointee. We've heard nothing. Former president, as I said, stripped of attorney-client privilege, and that was done in secret by another Obama judge. We have no idea why that occurred, and her order remains secret. We're talking about a former president, the leading Republican nominee for president, and all these secret trial activities going on. Former president was stripped of his executive privilege authority to protect his conversations with his former vice president and his staff while he was president of the United States. That's never been done before. No attorney-client privilege, no executive privilege. Criminalized a document dispute using a search warrant, a SWAT team from the FBI, and seized records. Never done before in American history. An abuse of law, the most aggressive use of the law to do something which is really outrageous. A secret search warrant, we just heard from another Obama judge, allowing the government to seize all communications the former president had on Twitter, including private communications. Again, trial by secrecy in a Democrat courtroom with a Democrat judge, a Democrat prosecutor, a Democrat grand jury, Democrat future jury. Now, why was that done in secret? The bogus argument, well, if he finds out that we're looking at his Twitter account, he may flee the country. Yeah, he'll leave his family, he'll leave Mar-a-Lago, he'll leave it all. He'll just flee the country. Now, how ridiculous is that? Now, what have they done? They use an 1871 Ku Klux Klan statute a 2002 Enron statute, and financial obstruction statute, none of which have anything at all to do with January 6th. They used the 1917 Espionage Act, which was passed by Woodrow Wilson to imprison his political opponents. Sound familiar? And it was applied against Eugene Debs, who was running for president on the Socialist Party, and he ran while he was in prison. I guess that's what the Biden administration thinks ought to happen now. Piling charges, as we say. That is, making multiple criminal charges from a single event. Just piling them on, piling them on. Now, why do they do that? Because they just want one conviction. And they want a jury to sit there and say, look, we got 40 charges here in the document case. All right, let's find guilty on one or two of them, and we'll clear them of the rest. That's what's going on. Every dirty trick imaginable. There's been relentless leaking of investigative, sensitive, and even concealed information to the media, in particular Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, to the Washington Post and to CNN. And I've demonstrated here, I have examples of over 40 leaks from this prosecutor in the Department of Justice in the past 6 months, in violation of federal law, to destroy the objectivity of any jury pool. And as for the New York Times, I want you to remember something. Their reporter in Moscow was a Stalin mouthpiece. During the Holocaust, their bureau chief in Berlin was a Hitler mouthpiece while they covered up the Holocaust. I want to remind you, the New York Times helped install Fidel Castro, who had 28 guerrilla militia behind him. That was it, to overthrow the government in Cuba, which was a corrupt government, but still, it wasn't a communist regime. And now the New York Times is trying to overthrow this government. In Atlanta, outrageous. Leaked district attorney's grand jury charges before the grand jury even met to vote on the charges. Indicted 19 individuals, including the former president, for exercising their free speech rights, organizing a challenge to an ongoing political campaign for president, seeking dual electors in an extremely close election, which, by the way, is done often, providing legal advice, lobbying state officials, and then accusing them all, because of all these so-called phony charges, of mob action. That is RICO, a mob law. A grand conspiracy to obstruct and overturn the election. In other words, they were charged for routine political activity. The DA, who represents only Fulton County, Georgia, county prosecutor, nonetheless claims to use evidence involving 6 other states outside of Georgia, uses allegations made by the Pelosi January 6th committee, which have since destroyed God knows how much material that they collected on that committee in order to prevent the former president from using any exculpatory information that they may have come across to defend himself. This is a federal matter, not a state matter. She's obviously coordinating with the Department of Justice and the special counsel, Jack Smith. We know this. She was directly asked if she was, and she said, I'm not discussing my investigation. That's a yes. And she's not discussing her investigation, which means she's been coordinating with Jack Smith. This is not only interference in a federal election, it's a bald-faced attempt to empower thousands and thousands of local and state prosecutors to decapitate the federal government. If there's a Republican candidate, if there's a Republican president. Just to decapitate it. More on that later. Now, in New York, what do we have? Let's not forget, New York, we have a DA, a Soros DA, a Democrat DA. He breathes life into a case that was rejected ultimately by the prior DA, another Democrat. And what is that about? Non-disclosure agreements. Non-disclosure agreements. It is a completely phony case. There's over 30 charges of federal crimes against the President of the United States. He takes misdemeanors, and they weren't even misdemeanors, but he takes them, turns them into felonies, makes these preposterous allegations, and that's the first set of indictments. Every one of these prosecutors is conflicted. Alvin Bragg, a Soros prosecutor, a radical Democrat in Manhattan, and he ran on charging Donald Trump. Fani Willis, a radical, elected Democrat who's fundraising off the charges against Donald Trump for her next election. Jack Smith, a former top official in the Eric Holder Department of Justice, worked closely with him, with former FBI Director James Comey and his general counsel, Andrew Weissman, who's all over MSNBC spewing his stupidity. And, of course, Smith's wife is a Democrat activist, an Obama sycophant, with a long record of prosecutorial abuses of process, that is, Jack Smith, pressuring and threatening witnesses, bankrupting criminal targets, leaking campaigns with friendly reporters like Haberman over there at the New York Times, other news outlets, the Washington Post, CNN, and so forth. Now, let's step back. This DA in Atlanta, as well as Jack Smith, what are they doing? What have they done? Alan Dershowitz wrote an important piece for the Daily Mail. And among other things, he says, during the course of our challenges, this is Bush Gore, he was representing the people of Palm Beach County in that litigation. Many tactics similar to those employed in 2020 were attempted. Lawyers wrote legal memoranda outlining possible courses of conduct, including proposing a slate of alternate electors who would deliver our preferred election results to Congress. This is normal. In 2000, Florida state officials were lobbied to secure recounts in selected counties, in which we thought the tally would favor us. We were trying to find at least 600 votes that would change the result. The new indictment features Trump's phone call with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, which was captured in an audio recording. In the conversation, Trump asks him to find 12,000 votes. In my mind, says Dershowitz, this call is among the most exculpatory pieces of evidence. Trump was entitled as a candidate to ask a Georgia state official to locate votes that he believes were not counted. Trump was told that in some of these Republican counties that the votes aren't in yet, or they can't, actually find the ballots and the votes. And he says, well, can't you find whatever it is, 11 or 12,000 votes? That's it. In 2000, attempts were made to influence various Florida officials to recount the votes. Now, the former president's request that Georgia's Speaker of the House reconsider the count is being considered as soliciting a public official to violate his oath. Do you understand the extent to which the criminal activity is the criminal activity of the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, and Jack Smith? They are the criminals. Let's look at what Hillary Clinton did. Oh, I know the media hate to do this because the media are frauds. On freedom of the press, an entire book on what the media have done to this country. This is not a free press. This is a Pravda, Russia-type press. This is a state press. This is a press that everything I'm telling you right now, they will never discuss. They will never have a legal analyst on there discussing it. The people who watch these programs, even though they have very, very small audiences, the big part of their audience, members of Congress, people in the White House, other press and influencers, that's their audience. That's their audience. As for these judges, judges are flesh and blood. They're human beings too, and some of them are better than others. Some of them are radical activist Democrats. Some of them are brilliant and objective. Unfortunately, Trump is getting most of the former. Entire book on that too. Men in Black. So what did Hillary Clinton do? She walks the country free. She's gaggling all over the place. She's getting into friendly media. She's laughing about all these indictments. Hillary Clinton should be in prison for her entire life. Over 4,500 criminal statutes in the U.S. Code that exist today. The one mostly used, the ones are conspiracy, false statements, money laundering, obstruction, perjury, mail fraud, wire fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion. Hillary Clinton. To convict Clinton, it must be shown that she acknowledged that classified emails were contained on her private server. And they said the most recent tally by the State Department of their review of 30,000 Clinton emails indicates at least 671 emails sent or received by Clinton contained classified information. This fact stands in stark contrast to the statement she gave to reporters in July of that year when she said, "I'm confident that I've never sent nor received any information that was classified at the time it was sent and received." According to the October 16th Fox News report, the FBI is also looking to see if Clinton committed gross negligence under the Espionage Act for failure to keep national defense information safe. 18 U.S.C. 793. They're using that against Trump. Notably, the information doesn't necessarily have to be marked as classified to violate the statute. The article cited an intelligence community source who spoke on the condition of anonymity. The intelligence source said the subsection requires the lawful possession of national defense information by a security clearance holder who, through gross negligence, such as the use of an unsecure computer network, permits the material to be removed or abstracted from its proper secure location. She even hired an IT person on her own dime who works for the Department of State to handle the server. That's how much she didn't want anyone to know about the server. And by the way, that's a crime too. You're not allowed to subsidize or receive private monies for doing what is a government job, and that's sort of what he was doing for her at her request, but nobody talks about that. She destroyed over 30,000 emails. They destroyed their cell phones. Nobody was dragged in front of a grand jury. There was no search done of her home for any other servers or information. She did an interview. Her staff was permitted to be there. Her lawyers were permitted to be there. Her lawyers destroyed this information based on header information, not substantive information, and she skates. In the Presidential Records Act that applies to Trump, which gives the president authority over documents like no other official in the government, including a Secretary of State or an ex-Secretary of State, she didn't have that defense. She didn't have that statute. Trump has that. And yet he's charged with 40 counts. And he's charged with a total of 91 counts from these three prosecutors. Now let's look at the Bidens quickly. You have a U.S. attorney stupidly appointed by Bill Barr, not a special counsel, who for 5.5 years investigating Hunter Biden. During the course of the 5.5 years, he allows the most significant tax violations to run. That is, outrun the statute of limitations. So good is he at this that Merrick Garland then appoints him as special counsel to give him more protection and more authority. Shortly after he's appointed as special counsel, another statute runs last week. Did you hear about that? Involving possible bribery. That one's now off the table. This guy created the sweetheart deal, and he approved it until the judge stopped them, and now Hunter Biden's lawyer is saying, you know, this judge is biased. We need a new judge. That's the guy they pick. The Bidens are involved in bribery, extortion, money laundering, false statements, fraud, FARA violations, and more. No investigation of Joe Biden whatsoever. No grand jury, no U.S. attorney, no special counsel, no public integrity section, nothing. And the man receives tens of millions of dollars. His family does, just because his family is so important. None of them have a real job. Not one of them. But they receive tens of millions of dollars from the Communist Chinese, over $31 million, according to Peter Schweitzer, nearly $50 million, according to Congresswoman Mace. We don't even know it's so big. And he's the president of the United States, who was bought and paid for, as is his family. Not one investigation of Joe Biden. And look what they're doing to Trump. Look how they're breaking the Constitution. Look how they're breaking the law. The law is being used to destroy the law.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.